Welcome to day 112 to day 118 of our chronological Bible study. That's April 22nd to April 28th. Week 18 in our study, but this is the 17th video. We've advanced through our horizontal books of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, and we're finishing up 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel this week. Remember, horizontal books move time forward. There's some passages from 1 Chronicles that mirror the passages from 1 and 2 Samuel. That's because the chronicler later on was using 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel as source documents then to write the Chronicles or the history of Israel. History that is in 1 Chronicles is actually the same history that is in 1 and 2 Samuel. However, the chronicler sometimes adds extra information in there. That doesn't mean it's inaccurate. It just means that the chronicler has added more information for the people of Israel so they can understand the context of the situation better. We've advanced through the kingdoms of Saul. We're in the kingdom of David now. The next king to come to power is going to be Solomon, which is David's son. Vertical books during this time period, during the kingdom era, are Psalms. There's 5 books of Psalms. The first 2 books are attributed to David, so that's why Psalms is placed during this time. The Psalms, however, are going to be spread out through the rest of the Bible. This Bible placed the Psalms in a place where it's logical for them to be. They're applicable to the events that's going on in the time that we're reading. Other vertical books that we're going to encounter fairly soon when Solomon is king are the books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. These are the wisdom books. Solomon was the wisest king, and therefore he produces 3 wisdom books. We're still roughly 1,000 years before Christ right now. The dominant powers during this time is Egypt and Assyria, which is up here. Its capital is Nineveh. And then Babylon, whose capital is Babylon. And then also we have Israel right here. Not a lot going on in the documented histories of Babylon and Assyria and Egypt right now. That's because Israel is the up-and-coming big dog on the block right now. Remember back the Chaldea, Abraham was from Ur of the Chaldeans. He was from Chaldea. That region we talked about last week. The people from this region are split up into 2 groups. They split up into the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And these 3 kingdoms are going to come into play as we move into the books of Kings and 2 Chronicles. There's going to be many battles fought between Israel and Egypt, and Israel and Assyria, and Israel and Babylon. Remember, David is a musician. David played the harp for Saul. He is responsible for the first 2 books of the 5 books of Psalms. So in the 5 individual books of the book of Psalms, there's 150 Psalms total. The first 2 books consist of the first 72 Psalms. So book 1 is 1 through 41. Book 2 is Psalm 42 through Psalm 72. And then the function of a psalm is for it to be a song for temple worship, or a song for worship in the tabernacle. And kind of similar to like our worship music we have today, or our hymns that we sing in church, the psalms functioned much the same way for the Israelites. And we have them written down in the book of Psalms, and we can learn a lot from them. They don't just serve as songs for us, they serve as a source of information about God and who the Israelites understood God to be. So it's very important to not brush off the Psalms as if, okay, those are just songs that were sung by people. It's important to actually examine the Psalms as well and look at the contents, because this is a direct reflection of how people viewed their relationship with God during these times. 2 Samuel chapter 5. Verse 1, then all the tribes of Israel went to David at Hebron. Hebron is functioning as the capital of David's kingdom during this time. They went to Hebron and told him, we are your own flesh and blood. In the past, when Saul was our king, you were the one who really led the forces of Israel. And the Lord told you, you will be the shepherd of my people Israel. You will be Israel's leader. So there at Hebron, King David made a covenant before the Lord with all the elders of Israel, and they anointed him king of Israel. This is kind of the same as when our president or our congressional leaders take an oath of office. This is what's going on here. He's making a covenant before the Lord, and he's saying that yes, he will rule rightly, he will obey the laws and the commandments that are associated with his office, and that he will rule fairly, rule justly, rule like God would have him rule. 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 17, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king of Israel, they mobilized their forces to capture him. Now why would they do this? This was because, remember, he had been living amongst the Philistines. The king of Philistia was very happy with David, and he had been telling the king that he was raiding into Judah, and he was fighting the king's enemies, which were the Israelites, and that wasn't really what was going on. David was actually deceiving the king of Philistia, and he was raiding down into the southern regions while building up his own fighting force. That was during the time he was running from Saul. And now Saul is dead, Samuel is dead, David has taken the throne, and now the ally that the Philistines thought that they had has now turned out to be their enemy. So he's been eating their food, he's been safely living in Philistia all these years, and now all of a sudden he is the king of the neighboring country who is at war, who is consistently at war with the Philistines. So they go out to capture him. But David was told they were coming, so he went into a stronghold, and the Philistines arrived and spread out across the valley of Rephaim. And David asked the Lord, "Shall I go out to fight the Philistines? Will you hand them over to me?" The Lord replied to David, "Yes, go ahead. I will certainly hand them over to you." So we see that David has this direct line of communication with the Lord, as did Joshua and Moses before him. And sometimes Saul did too, but later on in Saul's reign, after he lost the Lord's favor, he no longer had that. So he was just out there basically doing things on his own. And it says, verse 17, 1 Chronicles chapter 14 says, "So David's fame spread everywhere, and the Lord caused all the nations to fear David." And then 2 Samuel chapter 5 tells us that David then led his men to Jerusalem to fight against the Jebusites. Little known fact here that Jerusalem has now been occupied by the Jebusites, and the Jebusites are those people that Joshua and the second generation were supposed to wipe off the face of the map. And then we know that the third generation failed to do it, and then we had the whole 300 years of chaos in the Judges era. So the Jebusites are still there occupying Jerusalem. So David then goes to fight the Jebusites and conquers Jerusalem. And it says in verse 7, it says, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is now called the city of David. The verse 9, it says, "So David made the fortress his home, and he called it the city of David. He extended the city, starting at the supporting terraces and working inward, and David became more and more powerful because the Lord God of heaven's armies was with him." And most of these strong cities were built on top of plateaus, on top of a mountain, which is they call it a tell, T-E-L, call it a tell. So up on top of that, Jerusalem specifically, it's kind of like on a ridge, a mountain ridge, and they built the city up on top of that, and to make it a defensive fortress so that anybody that's attacking them has to fight up the hill to get to them, and it's more easily defendable because they're on top of the hill firing down at the people that are trying to advance on them. Jerusalem at this point doesn't have those walls that it has today, but it is on a high mountain, and it is a defendable fortress. And that just so happens to be the place where Solomon will build the temple later, and it happens to be the place where Abraham, way back in Genesis, where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. And then of course we know that a ram was provided by God, and he didn't have to go through with that. There's a lot of history to this specific mountain. David knows this is a highly defendable fortress, and that's why he wants it to make his new capital rather than Hebron. 1 Chronicles chapter 3, it says David reigned another 33 years in Jerusalem. So he reigned 7 years from Hebron, and then that was just reigning Judah, and then he reigned all of Israel from Jerusalem for 33 years. So for a total of 40-year reign, he was king, first 7 years of Judah, and the next 33 years of all of Israel, not just Judah. And after moving from Hebron to Jerusalem, this is 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 13. After moving from Hebron to Jerusalem, David married more concubines and wives, and they had more sons and daughters. David ends up with a lot of wives, which is one of the things that he's not supposed to do as king. He's not supposed to have lots of horses. He's not supposed to have lots of wives. And he's not supposed to accumulate a lot of wealth for himself. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 4 through 5 says, David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years in all. So that makes David 70 years old at his death. So then David, after occupying Jerusalem, decides that he wants to move the ark back to a place, a safekeeping. Remember that the ark is in the house of a man named Abinadab, and it's been there for the last 20 years. So how did the ark get in the house of Abinadab? So if we go back, we remember back before Saul was king, back before Samuel was the main prophet, priest, and judge of Saul's reign, there was a high priest named Eli. And remember, this was the priest that Samuel was taken to when he was first born. And this is the priest that Samuel was raised under. And Eli had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And during that time, Hophni and Phinehas decided that they were going to listen to the people, and they were going to take the ark to the front lines of the battle against the Philistines. And they happened to lose that battle. They lost the battle. The Philistines captured the ark. The Lord allowed them to do it because only Levites were supposed to carry it from the clan of Kohath, and they were supposed to carry it with these two special acacia wood poles. But the Lord obviously allows them to take it to prove this point that David's about to learn right now. And basically to prove the point that they can't use the ark as a lucky charm. They can't take it into battle and expect for just the fact that they carried this object into battle. The Lord cares about what's in their heart. And so they can't concentrate on the outwardly things. They need to concentrate on the inwardly things. And that's why he allows the ark to be captured, is for them to make this realization, and for David to make this realization that he's about to make here in a moment. So before that, the ark was kept in Shiloh. The tabernacle was set up in Shiloh. It was set up during the time of Joshua, so it had been there some time. And then after it was captured, it was taken to Philistia. And then it was passed around in Philistia because it brought plagues upon the people. Their idol, Dagon, fell over. His head was broken off. His hands were broken off, symbolizing that he couldn't see, hear, or think. And he couldn't do anything with his hands either. So in essence, it was a sign showing that their God was powerless compared to Yahweh, who dwelt amongst the ark there. So Philistines finally, they get tired of it and they send it back. They send it back to Judah. Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas are killed. The first place that sends back, it goes in there, and then 70 Israelites look inside of it, and then 70 of them are killed. And they decide they don't want it anymore, so they send it on further into Judah, and it ends up being at a place called Kiriath Jearim, and in the home of this man named Abinadab. And it's been there for the last 20 years. So now David is going to go to the house of Abinadab and take it and bring it back so it's under his safekeeping, so he can keep an eye on it. 1 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 1 through 5 says, David consulted with all his officials, including the generals and captain of his army. So he didn't consult with the Word of God. He didn't consult with the Torah, the law, and he didn't consult God. He consulted with the generals, officials, and captains of his army. Then he addressed the entire assembly of Israel as follows. He says, if you approve and if it is the will of the Lord our God, let us send messages to all the Israelites throughout the land, including the priests and Levites in their towns and pasture lands. Let us invite them to come and join us. It is time to bring back the ark of our God, for we neglected it during the reign of Saul. So you can imagine David is summoning all the witnesses that he can to witness this grand event that they're going to be bringing the ark where it's been in the house of Abinadab, and they're going to be bringing it into Jerusalem, this kingdom that he had just set up as his new capital of all of Israel. So this big assembly comes and they place it, this is the thing, they place it the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from Abinadab's house, which was on a hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, Abinadab's sons, that's the guy's house, that's the guy's house where the ark was kept. These are his sons. They're walking along, guiding it. And then one of the oxen stumble, and one of those sons, Uzzah, reaches out and steadies the ark to keep it from falling. And when he does that, he's killed. Nobody's supposed to touch that ark but the Kohathite Levites, who are designated to do that, and they're supposed to carry it with these special poles. Verse 9, he says, "How can I ever bring the ark of the Lord back into my care?" That's what David says. So David decided not to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom of Gath. The ark of the Lord remained there in Obed-Edom's house for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household. So David's stumped. He doesn't know what to do. How am I supposed to get the ark back into some place where I can keep a better eye on it? Now notice that David's not trying to put it back in the tabernacle where it's supposed to be. When God laid out how this system was supposed to work back in the desert of Sinai, when he laid it out with Moses and he gave all these commandments to Moses, the Ark of the Covenant is supposed to be placed inside the tabernacle in the Holy of Holies, in a place that only the high priest could go in and see. And you might wonder why David's not actually trying to bring it back with the tabernacle. And I think it's because David's just trying to keep a closer eye on it. Maybe he wants the power of the Lord to be with him. He wants to assure that. For whatever reason, he doesn't put it back inside the tabernacle. And you might be asking yourself, well, where's the tabernacle? Well, the tabernacle was initially set up at Shiloh. After they had conquered the land, the Lord told Joshua to set the tabernacle up in Shiloh. So they set it up there, and it stayed there at Shiloh until the ark departed from it. Hophni and Phinehas carried it into battle, and then it was lost. Then the Philistines had attacked Shiloh, so the tabernacle was moved from Shiloh. Shiloh was destroyed. They moved the tabernacle from Shiloh over to Nob. And you remember back the story where David is running from Saul, and David goes to the priest, and he says, I'm hungry, and the priest gives him the showbread, which isn't really the right thing because only the priests are supposed to eat the showbread. But he gives them the showbread to eat, and then he gives them Goliath's sword. That place was Nob. The tabernacle went from Shiloh to Nob, and then at Nob is where then Saul comes later on, and he's upset with the priest because they gave David the sword and fed him and didn't know where he went. So there Saul kills 85 priests while they're at Nob. So after that event, the tabernacle is moved again over to where it is during this time, which is at Gibeon. And it's been there ever since that time. So the tabernacle is at Gibeon, and the ark is in the house of Abinadab. And David's trying to bring it to Jerusalem for whatever reason, rather than bringing it to Gibeon and putting it inside the tabernacle. Later on, Solomon will unite the two. He will build a temple that's in design. It's very similar to the tabernacle. Solomon will then take the Ark of the Covenant and put it back in the Holy of Holies inside the temple that he builds. 2 Samuel chapter 6 verse 12 says that King David was told that the Lord had blessed Obed-Edom's household and everything he has because of the Ark of God, because the Ark was in his house. And then 1 Chronicles 15 tells us that David now built several buildings for himself in this city of David, and he prepared a place for the Ark of God and set up a special tent for it. Then he commanded that no one except the Levites may carry the Ark of God. The Lord has chosen them to carry the Ark of the Lord and serve him forever. Well, then how did David know this and he didn't know it before? But one of the things he was supposed to do is he was supposed to copy the law by hand and then carry that copy with him everywhere he goes, and he was supposed to read it daily. This is something that had been lost during the time through the Judges era, because Saul obviously didn't do it, and then David didn't actually know he needed to do it. But he actually went back, he actually went back and consulted the right sources rather than his officials and his the commanders of his army. He consulted the right source, which was the law, the Torah, which told him how to do everything. So he's now got the right way to do it is been revealed to him. Then he summoned all of Israel again to Jerusalem to prepare for this bringing back of the ark. And he assigned certain Levites to do it, right? And then it says down in 1 Chronicles 15 verse 11, it says, David summoned the priest Zadok and Abiathar and some other Levite leaders. Now if we remember who Zadok and Abiathar are, Zadok is a descendant of Eleazar, whereas Abiathar is a descendant of Ithamar. Both are sons of Aaron. Remember, Aaron was the priest of the Exodus. His son Eleazar was the priest of Joshua's conquest. These other two sons, they were killed in the desert. So Aaron only had two more sons, Eleazar and Ithamar. And then Eleazar was the high priest during the conquest era. His son Phinehas was the high priest during some of the Judges era. And then sometime during the Judges era, the high priesthood switched from the line of Eleazar over to the line of Ithamar, because one of the sons of Ithamar is Eli. And this was the guy that Samuel had been brought up under, okay? And then he had his sons Hophni and Phinehas. Remember that these were the two sons that were killed when they carried the ark into battle. And then Phinehas, well, he had several sons, and then from Phinehas comes Abiathar. So these two priests that David is going to consult here throughout these next few weeks that we're reading is Zadok here and Abiathar. Remember I discussed last week that Abiathar is the actual high priest, but Solomon is going to take the high priesthood and return it back over to the line of Eleazar. He's going to return it back to Zadok later when Solomon is king. So in verse 12, David says, You are the leaders of the Levite families. You must purify yourselves and all your fellow Levites, so you can bring the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, to the place I have prepared for it, the tent that he made for it in Jerusalem. Because you Levites did not carry the ark the first time, the anger of the Lord our God burst out against us. We failed to ask God how to move it properly. So the priests and Levites purified themselves in order to bring the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, to Jerusalem. Then the Levites carried the ark of God on their shoulders with its carrying poles, just as the Lord had instructed Moses. And then he designates some Levites to be musicians. You'll go through verses 16 there through 24, and you'll see the names of all those people and their duties as far as musicians. There's one named Asaph there. He's in verse 19, and he's also in verse 17. As we go through the Psalms, you'll see that a lot of the Psalms are attributed to Asaph, or they're written by someone else and given to Asaph. And Asaph is one of these musicians that's in charge of the music of the Psalms. So that's why they're written to Asaph. All right, down in verse 25, it says, Then David and the elders of Israel and the generals of the army went to the house of Obed-Edom to bring the ark of the Lord's covenant up to Jerusalem with great celebration. And because God was clearly helping the Levites as they carried the ark of the Lord's covenant, they sacrificed 7 bulls and 7 rams. David was dressed in a robe of fine linen, as were all the Levites who carried the ark, and also the singers, and Kenaniah, the choir leader. David was also wearing a priestly garment. So all Israel brought up the ark of the Lord's covenant with shouts of joy, blowing of ram's horns and trumpets, the crashing of cymbals, and loud playing of harps and lyres. But, we go to 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 16, But as the ark of the Lord entered the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked down from her window. When she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she was filled with contempt for him. You might ask yourself, why is Michal? Shouldn't this be a joyous occasion? Like all the people around her are joyous, they're all happy, they received the ark of the Lord back from the house of Abinadab. It's back under the king's care. Wouldn't she be happy? Well, she's not looking at that event with contempt, she's looking at David with contempt. And if we remember back to who Michal was, she was the first wife of David. And they were actually in love. This was Saul's daughter, King Saul's daughter, that David fell in love with. She loved him, he loved her. And then after her father, King Saul, started losing his mind, David went on the run. And Michal was given to another man to be his wife. So they were actually married, but then Saul still gave his daughter to another man. During that time that David was on the run, 20 years or however long it was, David married several other women. And by this time that he's bringing the ark into the city, Michal is there, but she's seeing her husband, whom she used to love in her youth, and maybe that she still loves, And they actually experienced a real, true love in their adolescence. And she sees him dancing and celebrating. And I think it's less about him celebrating before the Lord, but she sees him as maybe, she sees some hypocrisy in his actions because he's went and married all these women when they experienced something that was that she sees as true. But that's just me reading into it. 2 Samuel chapter 6 verse 17 through 19, it says, they brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the special tent David had prepared for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and peace offerings to the Lord. When he had finished his sacrifices, David blessed the people in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies. And then we have an example of a psalm here. In 1 Chronicles chapter 16, we have an example of a psalm. It says, on that day David gave to Asaph and his fellow Levites this song of thanksgiving to the Lord. So we have a psalm that's in 1 Chronicles chapter 16 that was given to Asaph, as I was talking about earlier. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, we finally get to the next covenant in our series. Now remember, we had progressed through the covenants before in chronological order. We had the Noahic covenant. The Noahic covenant was made with all of creation. That was because God had flooded the earth. And this covenant was made in an unconditional way. Noah and the inhabitants of the earth didn't have to do anything for God to honor this covenant. It was unconditional. God said He promises to do this regardless of what people do. It's an unconditional covenant. It was made with all creation, and the promise was not to flood the earth again. The sign of the covenant is something that God puts in place so that we can remember that promise that He made with us. That sign of the Noahic covenant is the rainbow. So when you look up, you see the rainbow. That's the sign that God has provided for us to tell us that He unconditionally promises us that He will never flood the earth again. All creation, deer, rabbits, people, everybody. That's His covenant with all of creation. The next covenant that we ran into was the Abrahamic covenant. And that also was an unconditional covenant. Abraham didn't have to do anything to get God to honor His word in that covenant. And that was made with Abraham and his descendants. That promise of that covenant promised Abraham and his descendants many descendants, so population, and it promised them land, that they were going to have a land of their own, and that they were going to receive blessings when they came into that land. The sign of that covenant, or the thing that they look at to remember that covenant, was the circumcision. So all the descendants of Abraham were circumcised, and that's how they remember the Abrahamic covenant. The Abraham covenant passed through his son Isaac, and then passed through his son Jacob, and then it finally got to the 12 sons that Jacob had that went into Egypt. Then, while they were in the desert, they came out of Egypt. During that time, they made another covenant, and that's called the Mosaic covenant or the Sinai covenant. And that covenant was made with all of Israel, the descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob. The descendants of Jacob, who already were observing the Noahic covenant, who already were observing the Abrahamic covenant. And it promised blessings once they entered the land of Canaan. The only thing was that the Mosaic covenant is a conditional covenant. If you go back and you read Deuteronomy, you read Exodus, you read Leviticus, you go back and you read the books of the law, you will see that God says, if you obey the law, if you do these things I'm telling you to do, I will bless you, and you will never have to worry about food. You'll never have to worry about anybody conquering you. You'll always have plenty of water. You will live abundantly. That was the promise He made to them in the Mosaic covenant if they obeyed the law. And we saw in the book of Judges how it only took 3 generations. In the 3rd generation that was there, they grew up in privilege. Their mothers and fathers were the ones that conquered the land. And they grew up in privilege there in that land of milk and honey. And you see how quickly they fell away from worshiping the Lord and obeying the law. So that was a conditional covenant. The sign of that covenant that was made with those Israelites in the desert was the Sabbath. So when they observed the Sabbath day, which is Saturday, when they observed the Sabbath day, that is their remembrance of the covenant that was made with the descendants of Jacob, that was made back in the Sinai desert, that was made. It was the Mosaic covenant. But the only catch was that was a conditional covenant. If you do something, I will do this for you. Now we've moved on to the next covenant. This is the Davidic covenant. The Davidic covenant is an unconditional covenant. When I read it, you will be able to understand. David doesn't have to do anything for this covenant to be upheld by God. The sign of that covenant is going to be that there'll always be someone on the throne of David who is a descendant of David. The Davidic covenant is in 2 Samuel chapter 7. It says, when King David was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all the surrounding enemies, the king summoned Nathan the prophet. So this is the prophet during David's time, during David's reign. David said, I am living in a beautiful cedar palace, but the ark of God is out there in a tent. Nathan replied to the king, go ahead and do whatever you have in mind, for the Lord is with you. But that same night the Lord said to Nathan, so Nathan's receiving this prophecy, that's his job as a prophet, is to receive the message from God and then take that message to whoever it is that God has that message for. The Lord says, go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord has declared. Are you the one to build a house for me to live in? I have never lived in a house from the day I brought the Israelites out of Egypt until this very day. I have always moved from one place to another with a tent and a tabernacle as my dwelling. Yet no matter where I have gone with the Israelites, I have never once complained to Israel's tribal leaders, the shepherds of my people Israel. I have never asked them, why haven't you built me a beautiful cedar house? Now go and say to my servant David, this is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared. I took you from tending sheep in the pasture and selected you to be the leader of my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have destroyed all your enemies before your eyes. Now I will make your name as famous as anyone who has ever lived on the earth. And we still talk about King David today. This is over 3,000 years ago. I will provide a homeland for my people Israel, planting them in a secure place where they will never be disturbed. Evil nations won't oppress them as they've done in the past, starting from time I appointed judges to rule my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Furthermore, the Lord declares that he will make a house for you, for David, a dynasty of kings. For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever. I will be his father, God will be his father, and he will be my son. If he sins, I will correct and discipline him with a rod, like any father would do, but my favor will not be taken from him as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from your sight. Your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time, and your throne will be secure forever. Here's a good place to talk about how prophets see prophecy. Unless they're given a direct message, when they see prophecy, they only see limited parts of it. And this becomes really evident when we read the major and minor prophets. And then we get to the New Testament and we look back and see how those prophecies are fulfilled in Jesus. The prophets, when they're receiving a prophecy, they'll see certain parts of the prophecy. Imagine that you were on top of a mountain and you're looking across a mountain chain and there's fog all around down in the valleys. And all you can see is those tops of those mountains across. The prophets see the mountaintops. They don't see what's on the sides of the hill or what's in the valleys. Okay? So when they receive that prophecy, they see those mountaintops, and those mountaintops are true. The events don't necessarily line up with our chronological time, because they're not seeing the whole story. They're seeing the tops of the mountains. They're not seeing the valleys. Then furthermore, they don't know how far these mountaintops are apart. Okay, these mountaintops of prophecy. It may look really close to the prophet. They may look really close together. They may tell them as a whole story, as if it's one event. But in fact, it's several events that take place, because they're not seeing how far these mountaintops are apart, and they don't see the information that's in the valleys between these mountaintops. So that's kind of what's going on here. When Nathan, he receives the word from the Lord, and he says, the Lord declares he will make a house for you, a dynasty of kings. Okay, that's true, right? He does. He makes a dynasty of kings that come from David. It progresses on for years and years and years. For when you die, from when David dies, and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. Probably talking about Solomon, who's David's son. He'll probably come after him. All right. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name. Okay, and Solomon does actually build the temple. And I will secure his royal throne forever. Okay, now that's not exactly what happens with Solomon. Solomon has a couple of sons, they fight over the kingdom, and then there is a descendant of Solomon on the throne for some time. For a number of years, there is a descendant of Solomon, hence a descendant of David, on the throne for a number of years. But it's not forever. The kingdom comes to an end. They get taken to Babylon, and there's no more kings of Israel. But still, the Lord says here that there will be somebody on his throne forever, on the throne of David forever. Well, that next person that Nathan is talking about there is Jesus, who's reigning on the throne. He says, I will be his father and he will be my son. See, we've transitioned from Solomon, now we've transitioned over to Jesus. We're talking about literally the Son of God. I will correct and discipline him with a rod like any father would do. That's talking about Solomon, obviously, because Jesus is not going to need to be corrected. But my favor will not be taken from him as I took it from Saul, probably talking about Solomon still, whom I removed from your sight. Your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time, and your throne will be secure forever. That's referring back to Jesus. We'll learn later on when we get to the time of Jesus that Jesus is a descendant of David, and because of this prophecy, Jesus comes as the Messiah, as the descendant of David who is supposed to rule over Israel, and yet he is rejected. So you can see that Nathan here, he was seeing Solomon and he was seeing Jesus, and he was seeing them as one event or one person, and it was in fact two events or two persons. We're going to pick up in 2 Samuel chapter 11. It says, late one afternoon after his midday rest, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. He sent someone to find out who she was, and he was told she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now remember, Uriah the Hittite, we talked about at the end of last week's video. Uriah the Hittite was one of the mighty men, the known men of David's close personal 70 or so warriors. Then David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to the palace, he slept with her. She had just completed the purification rites after having her menstrual period. Now remember, the purification period was after the menstrual cycle lasted just the right amount of time so that when she came back with her husband and they could have sex again, she was at the height of her cycle where she could most likely get pregnant. And this is the point where Bathsheba is right now in her cycle. Then she returned home. So he slept with her at this key point in her cycle, and then she returned home. Verse 5, later when Bathsheba discovered that she was pregnant, she sent a message to David saying, I'm pregnant. Then David sent word to Joab, which is his general, send me Uriah the Hittite. So what's David going to do here? Is he going to confess to Uriah? What's he going to do? Joab sent him to David, and when Uriah arrived, David asked him how Joab and the army were getting along and how the war was progressing. Then he told Uriah, go on home and relax. David even sent a gift to Uriah after he had left the palace. But Uriah didn't go home. He slept that night at the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. So David's trying to get Uriah to go home after he's been at war all these months. He's trying to get Uriah to go home so Uriah will sleep with Bathsheba to cover up this whole affair that's going on. But Uriah is this honorable soldier, and he says, well, my commander is in the field. The ark of God is under a tent. What right do I have as a soldier to be going home and sleep with my wife when all of my guys are still in the field? All of my guys are still at war. So that's not right. So I'm going to sleep right here on the ground rather than go home and sleep with my wife. He's trying to do the honorable thing by his men. Verse 10, when David heard that Uriah had not gone home, he summoned him and asked, what's the matter? Why didn't you go home last night after being away for so long? Well, stay here today, David told him, and tomorrow you may return to the army. So Uriah stayed in Jerusalem that day and the next. David invited him to dinner, got him drunk, but even then he couldn't get Uriah to go home to his wife. Again, he slept at the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. This is 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 14. So the next morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and gave it to Uriah to deliver. So he writes a letter to Joab and then gives it to Uriah to deliver to Joab. This letter instructs Joab to station Uriah on the front lines where the battle is fiercest and then pull back so that he is killed. So David just resorts to murder to cover up his affair with Bathsheba rather than just confessing his sin. So he tried to get Uriah to go home, sleep with his wife to cover it up, but that didn't work. He's too honorable of a man. So now he just has to kill him. So he sends him out. Joab does what he's told, and he sends kind of a incognito message back to David and tells him that the deed was done. They put Uriah up in the fiercest part of the battle up against the city wall, and then they pulled back and just left him there. And then of course he was killed because he was fighting up there. No matter how great of a warrior is, he's by himself fighting an army, he's going to perish. So David's pleased with the situation, but he's not going to be pleased here in a minute when the Lord contacts him about this indiscretion that he's done. Now remember that David is appointed as king by God, and we talked about several weeks ago about those to whom much is given, much is expected, and much is expected of David. He was selected over Saul to be king because of his heart, because he had a true heart, and because he truly feared God and he truly loved God and wanted to serve God. And because of his heart, David was selected. And this has to be reprimanded. David has to be punished for this, or he'll continue on and he'll devolve back into a man like Saul was. It says, when Uriah's wife, who was Bathsheba, heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. And when the period of mourning was over, David sent for her and brought her to the palace, and she became one of his wives. Then she gave birth to a son, but the Lord was displeased with what David had done. Then Nathan the prophet comes back to David, and in verse 11 of 2 Samuel chapter 12, he says, this is what the Lord says, because of what you have done. I will cause your own household to rebel against you. I will give your wives to another man before your very eyes, and he will go to bed with them in public view. You did it secretly, but I will make this happen to you openly in the sight of all Israel. Chapter 12, verse 13, he says, David confessed to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, yes, but the Lord has forgiven you, and you won't die for this sin. Nevertheless, because you have shown utter contempt for the word of the Lord, by doing this, your child will die. And this is Bathsheba's child that they had with the affair. And this is the child that David killed his friend Uriah the Hittite over. He's not going to get the son that comes out of this union, and he murdered his friend from that as well. Alright, we pick back up in verse 15. After Nathan returned to his home, the Lord sent a deadly illness to the child of David and Uriah's wife, which is Bathsheba. David begged God to spare the child. He went without food and lay all night on the bare ground. The elders of his household pleaded with him to get up and eat with them, but he refused. So this whole time that the child's still alive, he is humbling himself, and he's praying, and he's trying to do whatever he can to show the Lord that he's sorry for what he's done, and in hopes that he will spare this child. But the Lord said that he's going to do it, so therefore he has to do it, or God won't be a just God. He won't be honoring his word. That's what ends up happening. The child ends up dying. 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 24 tells us, then David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and slept with her, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and David named him Solomon. So they have another son named Solomon, and it's this son that actually becomes the next king of Israel. Then we run into the story of Absalom. He wasn't supposed to have lots of wives, and therefore he wasn't supposed to have all these different children from all different mothers. But you have two sons in particular in this part. There's one son named Amnon, and then you have another son named Absalom. Absalom has a full sister named Tamar. His half-brother is Amnon. 2 Samuel 13 verse 2 says, Amnon became so obsessed with Tamar that he became ill. This is his half-sister. They share the same father. She was a virgin, and Amnon thought that he could never have her. But Amnon had a very crafty friend who basically thought up this way to get Amnon alone with Tamar. So they carry out this plan, and Tamar ends up being alone with Amnon. Amnon takes advantage of Tamar in this situation. And then Absalom, her full brother, of course, gets upset about this, and then waits 2 years and concocts this whole plan of how he's going to pay back Amnon. Now he's going to punish Amnon for what he's done to his sister. He waits 2 years, and then he has a big banquet, and he invites all the brothers, all the sons to this banquet. So all of David's sons are there. And he, there at the banquet, slays Amnon. Now Absalom has slayed his half-brother Amnon. And his other sons go back and tell David, and then Absalom escapes. I guess because he thinks that the king will probably kill him for killing Amnon. Although we see it as kind of a virtuous act. You know, Amnon did a very horrible thing to his half-sister. He deserves whatever he got coming to him. For whatever reason, is worried that the king won't see it that way. And you'll see that the more we learn about David, we'll learn about how David is a father. David loves all of his children, and in David's view here, he's just losing more children. If one son kills the other son, then it doesn't change the amount of grief for him. He's still lost a child. David experiences grief over the death of his children, maybe more than his contemporaries. Verse 37. David mourned many days for his son Amnon. Absalom fled to his grandfather, Talmai, son of Ahimaaz, and the king of Geshur. He stayed there in Geshur for 3 years. So he waited 2 years to kill Amnon, and now he's staying away with his grandfather, his mother's family, for 3 years. And after that, King David reconciled Amnon's death, and he longed to be reunited with his son Absalom. But 3 years go past. Then Joab brings it to his attention that he needs to bring Absalom back. And when Absalom does come back, it's been 3 years, David says, Absalom may go to his own house, but he must never come into my presence. So Absalom didn't see the king. And that is another 2-year period where Absalom doesn't see the king. He's living back in Jerusalem, but he's not allowed to go before his father, the king, and they're not actually allowed to be reconciled. After 2 years, finally, Absalom talks to Joab, and he wants to see David, wants to see his father. So when he does, and down in verse 33, 2 Samuel chapter 14, it says, Joab told the king what Absalom had said. Then at last David summoned Absalom, who came and bowed low before the king. He bowed low before his father, and the king kissed him. And that's all information we have. We don't have any kind of conversation. We don't have any kind of information about some kind of reconciliation. No crying on each other's shoulder. None of that. The king kissed him. That's it. So, whatever happens in this little exchange here turns Absalom against his father. And in 2 Samuel 15, it says that Absalom bought a chariot and horses. He hired 50 bodyguards to run ahead of him. And he got up early every morning and went out to the gate of the city, where all the city elders sit at the gate of the city. When people brought a case to the king for judgment, Absalom would ask where in Israel they were from, and they would tell him their tribe. Now they know who Absalom is. They know that he's royalty. Absalom would say, "You've really got a strong case here. It's too bad the king doesn't have anyone to hear it. I wish I were the judge, then everyone could bring their cases to me for judgment, and I would give them justice." So Absalom starts undermining his father. And at the city gates, when all these people bring these issues in, they don't ever even get a chance to talk to David, because Absalom stops them before there, and he's undermining, he's taking the authority of his father. So when people tried to bow down to Absalom, he would stop them, and he would kiss their hand instead. So he's not doing this because he's really humble. He's really humble before the people. He's doing this because he's trying to gain their favor. Absalom did this with everyone who came to the king for judgment. And he stole the hearts of all the people of Israel. And he did this for 4 years. So he sits there at the gates for 4 years every day, everybody interacts with, and trying to gain their favor and undermine his father, King David. So then he spreads this rumor saying that he's been crowned king in Hebron. Remember, Hebron was the original capital of Judah, and now it is Jerusalem, because city of David moved the capital to Jerusalem and made it the city of David. So he goes to Hebron and he spreads this rumor that he has been crowned king. And all of Israel thinks that they have to rise up. They think, we have to help Absalom, and he's gained our favor through all these last 4 years. We all like this guy Absalom. He's a pretty likable fella. And meanwhile, this David guy, he's been sitting up on the hill, and we haven't actually heard much from him. So A messenger comes and tells David about what's going on. And here's where David shows his wisdom. David, instead of setting up a defensive perimeter and choosing to fight this battle with his son, he just leaves. He just takes all of his household except for 10 concubines and he leaves. And this shows David's heart. For one, he doesn't want his son killed, right? Even though he's misled in this moment, and even though he's rebellious, he doesn't want his son killed. He doesn't want to lose another son. And then two, he's trying to protect the city of David. He's trying to protect all the people in the city, and he's trying to not have a civil war go on here. In his wisdom as king, he is preventing a much greater evil than what's actually going on with this rebellion by his son Absalom. So with his household, he also takes 600 men in his personal guard. Zadok and Abiathar, those priests that we talked about earlier, they bring the ark, and they're like, hey, we got the ark, let's get out of here. And David tells them to go back, right? And then take their sons with them, okay? And these sons of Zadok and Abiathar, they're going to act as informants during this time that David is away from the capital. Or Ahithophel doesn't come. This is David's close advisor. Ahithophel decides to switch sides and support Absalom instead of David. And then there's another advisor named Hushai the Archite, and who wants to come with David. And David tells him to return to Absalom and be Absalom's advisor, but it's there to function as a person to counter Ahithophel's advice. Because obviously Ahithophel has betrayed David and he's moved over to the side of Absalom. David sends back Hushai the Archite to be an advisor there against Ahithophel, who's actually on the side of David. On his way out of Judah, there's a man named Shimei, is a relative of Saul. Remember, Saul was the previous king, and he throws rocks and curses at him. And then when Absalom actually occupies the town, there's no war, there's no fighting or anything. Absalom just rides up in there with all the support of Israel, rides up in there. And Ahithophel, the advisor, advises Absalom to sleep with those 10 concubines that David left behind to watch over his household. And this is in fulfillment of that punishment that David received for killing Uriah the Hittite, and also for his affair with Bathsheba. So part of that punishment was that somebody was going to rebel, somebody from his own household was going to rebel against him, right? And that someone would sleep with his wives in full view of the public. And this is where this happens. So Absalom actually does that. They set up a tent on the roof where everybody can see, and he sleeps with these 10 concubines on the roof. This horrible spectacle that's going on, sinful, horrible spectacle that's going on, it's actually there to fulfill that punishment that was given to David way back when. But because he does, Absalom asserts his dominance over the household of David in a very brutal, sinful way. And then Ahithophel, after that, Ahithophel wants to take 12,000 troops, a small fighting force, and go after David and kill him and the men that went with him. That's Ahithophel's advice to Absalom. And then Hushai, the Archite, the guy that's supposed to be there to counter the advice of Ahithophel, that's really working for David, right? Hushai is really working for David. He says, no, king. Your father's way too wise. He's way too much of a great warrior. He'll see right through this. They'll hide in little holes and caves, and they'll wait till we're in a vulnerable position. They'll come out and they'll strike us. And 12,000 is not nearly enough. You need to raise the entire army of Israel and go after them. And what's actually going on here, Hushai is trying to buy David time. Okay, so it takes a lot longer to raise an entire army of Israel, right? Hundreds of thousands of troops, than it does to take a little bitty force of 12,000 and go after them. Okay, so this is Hushai's strategy to try to buy David more time to flee and to find a place to find a defensive position. So Absalom actually listens to Hushai the Archite rather than Ahithophel. And it's kind of funny because Hushai the Archite is actually working against him, and Ahithophel is actually for him. But he takes the advice of Hushai because it's grander, it's bigger, it's showier. You know, we're going to raise the entire army of Israel to go after and kill King David, to hunt him down like a dog, right? So he goes with Hushai's advice, And of course, and then it takes all that time, it takes several days or weeks to raise up that army of Israel before they can go after him. Whereas if he'd listened to the guy that was actually on his side, if Absalom had actually listened to Ahithophel, which was on his side, that force of 12,000 could have been raised fairly quickly and then gone out to strike after David. So really, what's the moral of Absalom? What's the moral of what we've gone over today? David could have actually handled it much differently when Absalom came back. So after Absalom killed Amnon, he fled and he lived in Geshur for 3 years. Then after he came back to Jerusalem, he was there for 2 years. After that, there was another 4 years that went by while Absalom was conspiring against him. That's 9 years that passed between the time that Absalom killed Amnon and that David and Absalom hadn't actually been reconciled. If David had handled it a little bit different, sometime during that 9-year period, he would have actually embraced his son and told him that he forgave him and that they could have moved on. This may not be the outcome that happened right now. Things could have gone much differently. So the lesson we can learn as parents from this is that our kids are always going to do things we don't like. We should absolutely hold them accountable for the things they do and the things they don't do. The things that are sinful that they do. We should absolutely hold them accountable for those things. But they should never question our unconditional love for them. And this is my personal belief. I believe that that's what's going on here. Absalom turned against his father because they went through this whole 9-year period where David withheld his love from his son. Although he loved him very much. And you'll see this week when we read, we'll see when Absalom dies, David just beside himself. It's unfathomable anguish that he's going through when his son Absalom was killed. We know that David loves Absalom very much. But he withholds that love from David because he doesn't feel like he's worthy of it for some reason. He wants to hold it over his head. He wants to hold his love and use it as a weapon against Absalom. And that only causes Absalom to resent him, and it causes him to turn against him. And now this whole rebellion is going to happen, and Absalom is going to die also because of how David handled the situation. Now we know that God knew all this was going to happen. We knew that the providence was going to work out this way because Nathan delivered that message from God to David back after he had Bathsheba's husband killed. So we knew this was going to happen, but God knew that in his foreknowledge. But the lesson we can take away from this is if David had handled that situation with his son differently than he did, things may have worked out differently than they did. All right, that's all we got for this week. You guys have a great week. Love your wife, love your kids, love your husband, and love God.